Hey there riders, Moto Journo Kris here today, and I've just picked up Yamaha's XMax 300 and I've dropped off the NMax 155, and I thought I'd have a bit of a comparison between these two models because number one, the NMax is about $3,500 cheaper. So while it's half the capacity and doesn't have nearly as much of the technology and performance as the XMax 300, it's a really good value proposition, particularly for someone who doesn't really need to go over 100 kilometers an hour, because then you're really in that scooter's sweet spot. When you're upgrading to the XMax, you're getting a whole lot more. You're getting traction control. Obviously, both have ABS, both have disc brakes, front and rear, both have the dual footwell positions. There's a bit more storage and more secure storage on the XMax 300, right next to the ignition there as far as two closing areas, which will be able to hold a bit more, but also be closed up so that someone can't get into them when you're away from the scooter. This is a keyless entry system as well, so the whole scooter runs on that. There's no actual key itself. You use that ignition control to open the seat to get into everything, which is an interesting kind of feature. I know some people prefer the old school style key because it's just simple and there's less to go wrong, which is understandable. On this, you're getting much more complicated switch blocks. You're actually being able to go through the dash toggle on the switch blocks, but in reality this has got the dual clocks. It's got the speed and the tacho, and then it's got a digital display, which isn't all that different to the digital display you'll find on the NMax, apart from obviously the addition of the clocks. This has got a much taller screen. It's got wider bars so you can see further around you as far as those mirrors. Obviously LED lighting, not on the indicators though, but the XMax 300 is a big step up as far as kind of that premium feel when it comes to the scooter. It's got the larger wheels on it, which gives it more motorcycle-like handling. Definitely more of a maxi scooter feel to it, much like the T-Max, but not quite at that level of performance or size. This definitely has a taller seat height and it's a longer reach to the ground. I think part of that is because the scooter is just wider, whereas the NMax is much narrower. The NMax is much lighter as well, which means that for a lot of people it's going to be an easier thing to manage, whereas this you're starting to get up into the full-size motorcycle type of weight, you know, around that 160 kilo, 170 kilo mark from memory. This is obviously going to use a fair bit more fuel. The NMax is very light on fuel, but being scooters, fueling tends to be quite good. One of the big things I did notice on this is that the NMax actually has a bit more torque and a bit more punch just as you open the throttle, where this, the way the automatic drive is set up, is it's a bit gentler, but then it really develops that torque and that punch. And then obviously the performance on this is significantly higher, where on the NMax you're riding around a lot of the time and you've got to use the throttle to keep your speed and your momentum up, and you're using that a lot. On this, it's much easier to cruise along, and it's got a real cruising point where it just kind of sits at 4,000 RPM and just powers along beautifully, feels really smooth and nice. Whereas on the NMax, you've got to constantly be on that throttle, really generally speaking. The flip side to that is on the NMax, you roll off that throttle and you start losing speed quickly. On this, you do really need to use the brakes a lot more. It's got more of a flywheel effect in that it'll carry the momentum, but it won't drop off speed, and you know, you don't get that feel to it that you do on the NMax, where you do need to be a lot more active on the throttle. But I mean, at the end of the day, the extra performance on this is more than worth that difference. And I think for someone looking to do two-up touring even, obviously the T-Max would be the ideal choice, but if you don't want to go up to that kind of price range, something like the XMax 300 is going to be a good everyday commuter, and then it's also going to be an ideal kind of, you know, two-up, bit of a day touring machine. It's certainly capable of that. As far as the brakes, I was quite interested. When I first jumped on this, I did have to say the NMax brakes felt more powerful, but the real difference is the NMax is a lot lighter, so the smaller brake systems on that are very effective. On these, the brakes, they've got gentle bite to start off with, but then if you really get a lot of pressure on them, these brakes are very powerful. So in actual fact, I think this braking system is really exceptional, but the NMax being lighter and a very easy thing to handle, that definitely works well with its braking system. Interestingly enough, I think one of the big points of comparison I'd say between the two, Yamaha are very proud to say this has got more like the motorcycle style forks on it on the front, and certainly the front end setup is nicely sorted. The NMax front end, the forks were a much smaller fork, but they still did the job well. However, where there's one big point of kind of criticism I had for the NMax was that the rear was too harsh, whereas on the XMax 300 it's a much softer setup without wallowing, but it's just a more comfortable setup as far as the rear suspension. It's just got nicer damping on the rear, and it's a bit more controlled, and it doesn't get harsh over those kind of harsher bumps the way the NMax did. But obviously this is also a much heavier scooter, so there's a lot more weight in it. However, I'll show you in a second, but there's a lot more movement in that suspension, which is not surprising. You still get a side stand, you still get a center stand. It's got this enormous exhaust on it, again with just a plastic cover over it. But you know, it's a scooter, what do you expect? Both of them have a bit of mechanical noise to them as well. With the NMax, you'll probably notice it more because when you're rolling that throttle on, you're getting the mechanical noise, whereas on the XMax, it's much easier to cruise along and not need that. And obviously the build quality on the XMax 300 is a little bit higher. Not to complain about the NMax by any means, but just the overall build quality is a little bit higher on this machine. So I will have a full in-depth test up on the XMax 300 shortly, and I'll also do a video on the ergonomics, so stay tuned for that. If you've got any particular questions about this scooter, let me know. That's just my initial thoughts on kind of the differences having jumped from the NMax 155 onto the XMax 300, which I think is an interesting comparison for some people. The other thing I would note between the two scooters is, apart from obviously having that more premium feeling suspension on the XMax 300, it is a little bit more stable. Having the larger wheels as well, it's still a nice nimble quick turner, but it does slow things down a little bit, just a little bit, and gives it a better feeling of stability. And particularly, you know, mid-corner or when you're rolling along at really low speeds, you don't need to concentrate on keeping those bars straight like you did on the XMax a little bit. And I do think perhaps on the NMax it was because there wasn't as much weight over the front of the bike, which did give the front end a lighter feel, whereas on this it seems to be more balanced between front and rear. They've both got the same tyres on them, but I do have to say I did like the feel of the larger 15-inch wheels on this a little bit more, but I haven't had a chance to test them in the wet, which was where I wasn't quite so happy with the same tyres, those Dunlop Scoot Smarts, on the NMax 155. Anyway, that's just a very quick comparison between the NMax 155, which I just dropped off, and the XMax 300. Really just the first impressions of the XMax 300 as a direct comparison, even though I have tested this bike before, or this scooter before. Hopefully it gives you a bit of an idea about the difference, because there is a $3,500 difference. There's a big difference between these two scooters, and they do feel kind of different niches. But if you've got any questions about the XMax 300, I'll have an ergo and a review up on this as separate videos. As always, stay safe out there. Thanks for watching. Have a good one.